Welcome, everyone. Today we are embarking on a comprehensive, unvarnished exploration of the United States of America. We are stripping away the mythology to examine the core questions. What is the true origin of America? Who actually founded it? Why was it founded? How did it evolve from a loose coalition of colonial outposts into the preeminent global superpower? And finally, what is the stark reality of the American project today? Joining me to dissect this are three preeminent historians. Dr. Maya Vance, a scholar of Indigenous history and American social movements. Dr. Elias Thorne, whose work focuses on early American political philosophy and constitutional law. And Dr. Sarah Chen, an expert in economic history and global geopolitics. Let us begin at the absolute beginning. Dr. Vance, when we ask about the origin of America, the dates 1492 or 1776 are reflexively offered. How fundamentally flawed is that starting point? It is fatally flawed, Alex, because it relies on the myth of the pristine, empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. The true origin of the American continent's human history begins tens of thousands of years before a single European sail appeared on the horizon. The landmass we now call the United States was home to millions of indigenous peoples belonging to hundreds of distinct nations, speaking diverse languages, and practicing complex forms of agriculture, trade, and governance. We must acknowledge civilizations like the Mississippian culture, which built the massive urban center of Cahokia near modern-day St. Louis, a city that in the 12th century was larger than London. In the Northeast, the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois Confederacy, established a sophisticated participatory democracy, a great law of peace that united 5 distinct nations. This pre-existing political sophistication is vital because the origin of the modern United States is not a story of creation from nothing. It is a story of profound, violent collision. It is the story of European expansion crashing into entrenched, sovereign, indigenous civilizations. I agree entirely with Maya's framing of the collision. To understand the European side of that collision, which eventually dictated the political architecture of the nation, we have to look at the massive shifts occurring across the Atlantic in the 15th and 16th centuries. Europe was exiting the Middle Ages. The Renaissance had sparked intellectual curiosity, but more importantly, the emergence of consolidated nation-states and the desire to bypass the Ottoman Empire's control of the lucrative Asian spice trade drove monarchs to seek new maritime routes. The Spanish and Portuguese arrived first, extracting immense wealth in silver and gold from Central and South America, which entirely disrupted the global economy. The English arrived relatively late to the game. When they finally established a foothold in North America at the turn of the 17th century, their motivations were a complex amalgamation of intense geopolitical rivalry with Spain, domestic economic pressures, and a fervent, often radical, religious landscape following the Protestant Reformation. And we see these differing motivations crystallize perfectly in the first 2 successful English settlements, which effectively established the dual, often competing DNA strands of the American national character. In 1607, you have Jamestown in Virginia. Jamestown was not founded by idealists. It was founded by a corporation, the Virginia Company of London. It was a joint stock venture funded by wealthy investors looking for a return on their capital. They initially looked for gold, failed miserably, starved, and nearly abandoned the project. The settlement only survived because they discovered a highly addictive, highly profitable cash crop, tobacco. Jamestown embedded a ruthless, profit-driven frontier capitalism into the American soil. And crucially, to maximize the profitability of that tobacco, they required cheap, exploitable labor. This economic imperative led directly to the violent displacement of the Powhatan people, and in 1619, the arrival of the first enslaved Africans. The economic foundation of early America was undeniably built upon the bedrock of racialized chattel slavery. Then, 13 years later, in 1620, you have Plymouth, and shortly after, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. These northern settlements were driven by a vastly different impulse. The Pilgrims and Puritans were religious dissidents who believed the Church of England was beyond saving. They came to the New World to establish a theocratic society, what John Winthrop famously called a city upon a hill. They viewed their endeavor as divinely ordained, a covenant with God to create a model society of moral purity that the rest of the world would look up to. So right from the inception, you have this profound dichotomy. On one hand, an aggressive, extractive, profit-maximizing economic engine in the South. On the other, a deeply moralistic, exceptionalist, and ideological mission in the North. The entire history of the United States, arguably up to this very morning, is the friction and negotiation between these two foundational impulses. Let us move forward to the 18th century. Dr. Thorne, the term Founding Fathers, carries a nearly mythological weight in the United States. Who exactly were these men, and why did they decide to sever ties with the most powerful empire on the planet? The men we call the Founders were a remarkably specific demographic. They were overwhelmingly wealthy, highly educated, propertied white men. They were plantation owners like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, brilliant legal minds like John Adams, financial prodigies like Alexander Hamilton, and polymaths like Benjamin Franklin. They were deeply steeped in the European Enlightenment. They read John Locke, who argued that human beings possessed natural rights to life, liberty, and property, and that governments are formed by a social contract to protect those rights. They read Montesquieu, who argued for the separation of powers. Why did they rebel? For over a century, the American colonies enjoyed what historians call salutary neglect. Britain was busy fighting wars in Europe and largely left the colonies to govern themselves. The colonies developed their own local legislatures, a vibrant press, and deeply localized economies. They viewed themselves as loyal British subjects, but subjects who possessed the traditional rights of Englishmen, chief among them the right to consent to taxation. The pivot point is the end of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, in 1763. The British Empire won, expelling the French from North America, but the victory bankrupted the British Treasury. The Parliament in London looked at the American colonies, which were enjoying extraordinary economic prosperity and demographic growth, and decided it was time the colonists paid for the military protection the empire had provided. They passed a series of taxes: the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act. In purely economic terms, the taxes were not oppressive. They were actually quite low. But as Elias mentioned, the issue was not the financial burden. It was the constitutional precedent. Exactly. No taxation without representation. The colonists had no elected representatives in the British Parliament in London. To be taxed without their explicit consent via their own local legislatures was, in their political worldview, a violation of their fundamental rights. It reduced them from free subjects to vassals. When the British government responded to colonial protests with military force and the suspension of local governance, the colonists felt the social contract had been fundamentally breached. This escalated from a dispute over tax policy into a full-blown crisis of sovereignty. But we must critically examine the hypocrisy embedded in this rebellion. When Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence in 1776, he wrote the most consequential sentence in the English language. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." It is a breathtaking philosophical achievement. Yet, as he penned those words, Jefferson legally owned hundreds of human beings. Washington owned enslaved people. Madison owned enslaved people. The men declaring a universal right to liberty were actively perpetuating the most profound denial of liberty imaginable. Furthermore, the Declaration explicitly refers to indigenous populations as merciless Indian savages. So, when we ask, who founded America, we must acknowledge that the founders designed a republic specifically for men like themselves. The profound contradiction of a nation conceived in liberty, but built on slavery and indigenous dispossession, is the original sin of the United States. It is a paradox that the nation has never fully resolved. They win the Revolutionary War against extraordinary odds. But winning a war and building a functioning nation are entirely different endeavors. Dr. Chen, how did they construct the government we recognize today, and why was the first attempt a failure? Their first framework, the Articles of Confederation, was a deliberate overcorrection to the tyranny of the British Crown. They were terrified of centralized power, so they created a federal government that was functionally impotent. It could not levy taxes. It could not regulate interstate commerce, and it could not easily raise a national army. It was essentially a firm league of friendship among 13 independent squabbling nations. By 1787, the new nation was facing economic collapse, hyperinflation, and armed domestic rebellions like Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. The elite realized that without a stronger central authority, the United States would fracture and be picked apart by European empires. This led to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. The United States Constitution of 1787 is not a philosophical manifesto like the Declaration. It is a remarkably cynical, incredibly pragmatic piece of legal engineering. Men like James Madison operated on the assumption that human beings are inherently selfish and power-hungry. Therefore, you cannot rely on the virtue of leaders. You must design a system where ambition is made to counteract ambition. This is the genius of the separation of powers, creating independent executive, legislative, and judicial branches that constantly check and balance one another. They invented federalism, dividing power between the national government and the state governments. However, the pragmatic engineering of the Constitution required horrific moral compromises to ensure the southern states would join the Union. The delegates agreed to the 3/5 compromise, which counted 3 out of every 5 enslaved individuals for the purpose of allocating political representation in Congress, giving the slaveholding South wildly disproportionate political power for decades. They also prohibited the federal government from banning the international slave trade for 20 years and included a fugitive slave clause requiring free states to return escaped enslaved people. The founders essentially hardwired the institution of slavery into the supreme law of the land. They prioritized the creation of the Union over the fundamental human rights of millions. They kicked a highly explosive ideological and economic powder keg down the road, hoping a future generation would solve it. That powder keg eventually detonated in the 19th century. Dr. Vance, as the nation expanded, how did this internal division lead to the crucible of the American Civil War? The 19th century is defined by the ideology of manifest destiny, the deeply ingrained belief that the United States was divinely commissioned to expand its democratic institutions and capitalist economy across the entire North American continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This expansion was achieved through a combination of massive land purchases, like the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which doubled the size of the country overnight, military conquest, notably the Mexican-American War, and the systemic, violent removal of indigenous nations, such as the atrocity of the Trail of Tears under President Andrew Jackson. But every time the United States acquired new territory, the same toxic question arose: would this new land be open to slavery, or would it be free? Dr. Sarah Chen. Economically, the country was tearing itself in half. The North was rapidly industrializing. It was building massive canal systems, thousands of miles of railroads, textile mills, and factories. It was developing a free labor economy fueled by waves of European immigrants. The South, conversely, had doubled down on an agrarian economy centered almost entirely on one incredibly lucrative commodity: short staple cotton. The cotton gin had made processing this crop highly efficient, and the insatiable demand from British textile mills made Southern plantation owners unimaginably wealthy. But this entire economic model relied absolutely on the brutal exploitation of enslaved black labor. You had two completely incompatible socio-economic systems sharing one political roof. The political compromises designed to keep the balance of power in the Senate, the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, ultimately failed because the systems were fundamentally irreconcilable. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was the breaking point. Lincoln was not initially an abolitionist, but he firmly opposed the expansion of slavery into the new Western territories. The Southern states knew that if slavery could not expand, it would eventually be suffocated politically. So they seceded, forming the Confederate States of America, and initiated the American Civil War. It remains the deadliest conflict in American history, costing over 600,000 lives. But the war fundamentally transformed the nation. Through the Emancipation Proclamation and the eventual passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the Constitution was radically altered. Slavery was abolished. Birthright citizenship was established, and the guarantee of equal protection under the law was codified. Lincoln redefined the United States. It was no longer just a union of states. It was a singular nation dedicated to a new birth of freedom. Following the Civil War, the United States transforms from a fractured republic into an industrial colossus. Dr. Chen, how precisely does America become a world power in the late 19th and early 20th centuries? The trajectory from the end of the Civil War in 1865 to the beginning of World War I is perhaps the most explosive period of economic growth in human history. To understand why America became a superpower, you have to look at its unparalleled geographic and material advantages. The United States possessed a massive unified continental landmass, completely insulated by two oceans, meaning it never had to fear a sudden land invasion by a rival major power. It possessed staggering untapped natural resources, endless supplies of coal in Appalachia, iron ore in the Great Lakes region, timber in the Northwest, and later, oceans of oil in Texas and Pennsylvania. It also possessed the most extensive navigable river system in the world, the Mississippi watershed, which allowed for incredibly cheap transport of agricultural and industrial goods. Coupled with those natural advantages was a government willing to fiercely protect and subsidize industry. The federal government gave away massive tracts of western land to railroad companies to build the Transcontinental Railroad, uniting the national market. High tariffs protected nascent American manufacturing from European competition. And you had a completely open door to immigration, bringing tens of millions of people from southern and eastern Europe, Ireland, and Asia, providing an endless, cheap labor force for the steel mills, coal mines, and meatpacking plants. This was the Gilded Age, the era of the robber barons, men like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan, who utilized ruthless business practices to build monopolies and amass unprecedented personal fortunes. By the turn of the 20th century, the United States was producing more steel, more coal, and more manufactured goods than Great Britain, Germany, and France combined. We must note that this staggering wealth was built on intense human suffering. The labor conditions were horrific, leading to the rise of the American labor movement, violent strikes, and the gradual bloody fight for basic rights like the 8-hour workday and child labor laws. Furthermore, as the internal frontier closed, this massive industrial machine began producing more goods than the domestic market could absorb. American capitalists demanded access to foreign markets. This economic imperative drove the shift from isolationism to imperialism. In 1898, the United States provoked the Spanish-American War. It was a brief, highly uneven conflict that resulted in America acquiring overseas colonies, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The United States violently suppressed a Philippine independence movement in a brutal counterinsurgency. America was no longer just a republic. It was an empire projecting naval power on a global scale. This brings us to the 20th century, the era where American hegemony becomes undeniable. Dr. Thorne, how do the two world wars solidify this dominance? The world wars were the catalyst that forced the United States to utilize its immense latent power on the global stage. When World War I broke out in Europe, the U.S. maintained a stance of neutrality for 3 years. When President Woodrow Wilson finally brought the country into the conflict in 1917, he framed it in deeply ideological terms. To make the world safe for democracy, the infusion of American troops, and crucially, American credit and industrial capacity, broke the stalemate. However, the subsequent peace process disillusioned the American public. The Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles and refused to join the League of Nations. The U.S. retreated into a policy of strict political isolationism during the 1920s and 1930s, even as authoritarianism rose in Europe and Asia. World War II is the true inflection point. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 obliterated American isolationism overnight. The American response was an industrial mobilization unlike anything the world had ever seen. The United States became the arsenal of democracy. We produced airplanes, tanks, ships, and munitions at a rate that mathematically overwhelmed the Axis powers. But the critical factor is the state of the world in 1945. Consider the geopolitical landscape when the guns fell silent. Great Britain was functionally bankrupt, and its empire was crumbling. France was traumatized and rebuilding from occupation. Germany and Japan were bombed into absolute ash. The Soviet Union had won the brutal land war in the East, but at the incomprehensible cost of 27 million dead and its Western industrial base annihilated. The United States, by stark contrast, was untouched. The homeland had not suffered a single major bombing raid. The American economy had doubled in size during the war. The U.S. controlled roughly half of the entire world's manufacturing capacity and held the vast majority of the world's gold reserves. Furthermore, the United States possessed a total monopoly on the most destructive weapon ever created, the atomic bomb. In 1945, the United States was not just a superpower, it was a hyperpower. Recognizing the catastrophic failure of post-WWE isolationism, American leaders deliberately constructed a new global architecture designed to prevent another world war and, frankly, to serve American economic and strategic interests. Exactly. They hosted the Bretton Woods Conference, establishing the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. They pegged global currencies to the US dollar, which was in turn backed by gold, making the dollar the undisputed global reserve currency. They spearheaded the creation of the United Nations. They implemented the Marshall Plan, pouring billions of dollars into rebuilding Western Europe, not just out of charity, but to create stable democratic trading partners and to establish a bulwark against the expansion of Soviet communism. This sparked the Cold War, a terrifying four-decade bipolar struggle between the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union. It was characterized by the omnipresent threat of global nuclear annihilation, fierce proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam, and a massive technological competition that pushed human beings to the surface of the moon. And yet, while the United States was positioning itself as the leader of the free world abroad, it was confronting massive internal hypocrisies. During the height of the Cold War, millions of Black Americans were subjected to the brutal, legalized apartheid system of Jim Crow in the South. You cannot overstate the importance of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Activists like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, and countless ordinary citizens forced the nation, through nonviolent protest, civil disobedience, and often shedding their own blood, to finally begin honoring the promissory note written in the Declaration of Independence. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 dismantled legal segregation. It was a second reconstruction of the American reality, driven entirely from the bottom up. The Cold War ends with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. We enter the 21st century in what was called the unipolar moment, but looking at the landscape today, that moment seems to have passed. Dr. Chen, what is the economic and geopolitical reality of the United States right now? The reality today is that the era of uncontested American hegemony is unequivocally over. We have transitioned back into a multipolar world characterized by intense great power competition. The defining geopolitical reality of the 21st century is the rapid, breathtaking rise of China. Decades of globalization, heavily championed by the United States to open new markets, resulted in a massive transfer of manufacturing capacity to Asia. China has leveraged this to become an economic titan, a technological peer, and a rapidly expanding military power that aggressively challenges American influence in the Indo-Pacific. Furthermore, the global architecture the U.S. built after World War II is deeply strained. The United Nations is often paralyzed. The World Trade Organization is struggling. The U.S. has utilized economic sanctions so aggressively that rival nations, particularly the BRICS countries, are actively attempting to de-dollarize their economies to insulate themselves from American financial leverage. The U.S. remains the world's largest economy and possesses the most powerful military, but its ability to unilaterally dictate global outcomes is severely diminished. Internally, the political reality is characterized by a profound institutional crisis. The United States is currently experiencing a level of partisan polarization not seen since the 1850s. The Madisonian constitutional system we discussed earlier, the intricate system of checks and balances, was designed to force consensus and compromise. However, in an era of hyper-partisanship, fueled by heavily siloed, algorithmically driven media ecosystems where citizens do not even agree on basic empirical facts, that system is breeding catastrophic gridlock. We are seeing a dangerous erosion of democratic norms. Confidence in the Supreme Court, the Congress, and the presidency are at historic lows. There is a pervasive sense that the political system is captured by extreme fringes and elite donor classes, leaving the vast majority of citizens feeling unrepresented and deeply cynical about the future of the republic. This political dysfunction is inextricably linked to the economic realities facing the American working class. The post-World War II economic boom created the largest, most prosperous middle class in human history. That social contract has fundamentally broken down. The transition from an industrial, manufacturing-based economy to a digital service and finance-based economy has generated staggering wealth for those at the very top, but it has hollowed out the middle of the country. We are seeing levels of wealth inequality comparable to the Gilded Age. You have immense technological innovation taking place in Silicon Valley, producing life-changing medical advancements and AI, while simultaneously, life expectancy in the United States has actually declined due to deaths of despair, opioid overdoses, alcoholism, and suicides, often clustered in deindustrialized regions. The American dream, the fundamental belief in upward economic mobility across generations, feels increasingly like a cruel fiction to millions of young Americans burdened by astronomical housing costs and student debt. Given this stark assessment, the geopolitical challenges from China, the breakdown of the post-World War II order, intense political polarization, and severe economic inequality, how should we contextualize the American project today? Is it failing, or is it merely evolving? I do not believe it is failing, but it is undergoing a severe stress test. We must remember that the United States is not a nation founded on a shared ethnicity, an ancient shared religion, or a monarchical bloodline. It is a nation founded entirely on an idea, a set of philosophical propositions codified in law. Because it is an ideological project, it is inherently fragile and requires constant, active maintenance by its citizens. The founders gave us a republic, as Benjamin Franklin famously said, "if you can keep it." The reality today is that keeping it requires reforming institutions that were built for an 18th century agrarian society to function in a 21st century, hyper-connected, digital global economy. It requires redefining what citizenship and shared responsibility mean in an age of intense individualism. From a global perspective, betting against the United States has historically been a poor wager. The nation possesses remarkable structural resilience. It still retains the most dynamic innovation economy in the world. It is the global leader in artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and aerospace. It possesses a deep, highly liquid financial market. It has favorable demographics compared to the rapidly aging populations in Europe and East Asia, largely due to its historical, albeit currently highly contested, capacity to assimilate immigrants. The geographic advantages that allowed it to become a superpower in the 19th century, the oceans, the rivers, the arable land, have not vanished. The challenge is not a lack of capacity or resources. It is a crisis of collective will and political functionality. I look at the reality today through the lens of continuous struggle. The history of the United States is not a steady, uninterrupted upward trajectory toward justice. It is a jagged line, marked by periods of immense progress, followed by fierce, often violent retrenchment and backlash. The abolition of slavery was followed by Jim Crow. The civil rights movement has been followed by renewed battles over voting rights and systemic inequality. The reality of America is that it is fundamentally an unfinished project. The preamble to the Constitution sets the goal to form a more perfect union. That comparative adjective, more perfect, is an explicit admission that perfection is unattainable, but the pursuit of it is the defining national purpose. The true founders of modern America are not just the men in Philadelphia. They are the suffragettes who demanded the vote, the labor organizers who bled for basic workplace protections, the civil rights activists who marched through tear gas, and the millions of ordinary people today who continue to demand that the nation live up to the breathtaking rhetoric of its founding documents. The origin is complex, the history is brutal, the rise to power was ruthless, and the current reality is incredibly fraught. But the American capacity for reinvention remains its most defining and potent characteristic.